It's important to understand the lived experience of each of the generations. In a boomer's mind, there is an org chart, and they're somewhere at the top. Generation X kind of works hard and parties hard. I think about millennials and Gen Z are hands-on, and then Xers and boomers are hands-off. The millennials were the masters of social media, and the Gen Z are the victims of social media. All that the Gen Z knows is the kind of chaos that goes on. You have the younger generation saying, I don't like these ground rules, they're stupid. The world's in a horrible mess, and I think we need to fix it. So they want to understand what the story is of an organization. They are not anti-remote, they're pro-connection. We're combining digital with human-centered priorities. There's a 13% drop in positions that would have gone to humans that are not going to bots. That's a massive topic we could spend another hour on. They've gone through school and they did really well, and they're really smart, they're really book smart, but to get into the real world, it's completely different. And they're showing up and they're like 22 and they don't know what's going on. So and there's social awkwardness.
We've spent decades designing work environments around older generations, but what happens as Gen Z enters the workplace and the rules start to change? They're coming in with very different expectations, different values, and an entirely different relationship to work. And whether we're ready or not, they're already influencing how teams collaborate, how leaders show up, and even how the workplace is used. Welcome to What the F is Happening to the Office, the podcast where we explore the big shifts redefining how and where we work. I'm Bob Fox, founder of Work Design, and in each episode, I sit down with leading thinkers to unpack the issues and forces transforming the work environment. If you enjoy conversations like this, we welcome your participation. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and share this episode with someone who's thinking deeply about the future of work. Today's guest is Warren Wright, one of the nation's top experts on generational research and leadership. He's the founder and CEO of Second Wave, where he helps leaders prepare the next generation and create better collaboration across multiple generations. Warren's a former managing partner at Gallup, where he helped design and lead initiatives on employee engagement, leadership, and organizational change, and even contributed to the development of Clifton Strength Finders assessment. He's the author of Second Wave Millennials, editor-in-chief of the C-Suite Newswire, and he has advised clients like the World Bank, Viacom, Citibank, and Goldman Sachs. His insights on generational inclusion, values, and workplace dynamics couldn't be more relevant to this moment of transition. In this episode, we explore how Gen Z is changing the game, how generational differences are showing up in team culture and leadership expectations, and what organizations must do to bridge the gap between seasoned professionals and rising talent. Warren, welcome. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, Bob, I am too. It is great. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Give us a little background how you came to focus on generational research.
Yeah, I have been more or less in the social sciences, and social research for most of my life. And I was exposed to large amounts of data when I worked at Gallup. We had asked questions about just about everything. But one of the things that we didn't really spend time asking about was generational differences. And I had a mutual friend, actually, that introduced me to someone whose name is Neil Howe. And Neil and his author partner, Bill Strauss, wrote a book called Generations in 1991. And it was a seminal book that really kind of actually gave millennials their name in that book. And it was the first book that really kind of put forward that generations are in fact different and in fact have remarkable impact on the way we live our lives, what the future holds. You know, one of the things that I've been fascinated with is if you spend time looking at a younger generation, you get a pretty good idea of how and where the country's going and what the leadership is going to look like and how things might be looking from a political, geopolitical, social standpoint, not necessarily technology because that happens so fast. But I sat down with Neil Howe. We were supposed to have an hour lunch, and it was 3.5 hours we spent talking, and he was teaching me about generations. And I said, did people know about it? I mean, people know about this? He's a guy, he's an author, he's got the book out and everything. It was a bestseller, one of Bill Clinton's 7 top books ever. It was, in back of him in the Oval Office. I never heard of it. I wasn't familiar with it, but, Neil is he's a demographer and a historian and an economist. He's not a businessman. And so I said, well, we could do some consulting around this to really put our minds to it. And so we did. And so we advised clients. The organization was bought actually by a provider of information to hedge funds. Believe it or not, we were kind of getting into economic and financial predictions based on generational trends and stuff like that. So anyway, I started my own company in 2017. And have been just doing generational consulting ever since, and really teaching leaders about how and why and why it's important and what it is and what it means to the future of work.
Yeah, no, I think it makes a huge difference when people come together and work. Their perceptions are very different. But what do you see as the biggest generational shifts reshaping the workplace?
I think, okay. So, you can't have a conversation, these days on a podcast without just saying, wow, things are really different now than they used to be, even 5 years ago, right? The world is changing so fast. And I guess the way to answer that is to put it all in context with where we are in the workplace right now. So McKinsey introduced a model which I thought was quite good. It is called the 4 paradigms of work, and in it they kind of look at basically the history of the relationship with humans to work. And so paradigm 1 is the migration from the farms to the factories. We started to get smaller and less in shape, and because we're sitting in our bodies literally changed, right? That's just one of the things. Of course, Industrial Revolution and manufacturing introduced in England in the mid 1800s and so forth. So the economy's changed, everything changed as a result of that. And that was a big shift. Paradigm shifts are large scale shifts, are not just trends. So that was a big paradigm shift. The second paradigm shift was World War II. We had 10 million men that went to Europe and Asia and Africa to fight in the war. That's a lot of people. And there was no one around to work in those factories that we moved to. And so women entered the workforce. And that changed the entire dynamic. All of a sudden, you had half of the population of 175, 200 million people that were eligible potentially for work. And then the third change was in the 1990s, the introduction of the World Wide Web. The technology that came along with it, the automation. There's all these books, Friedman wrote a book about the world getting smaller and everybody's able to communicate with each other. We weren't able to do that. You could actually, communicate with someone in China, like real time. It's like, wow, that was like in the 80s and 90s. You think like, oh yeah, that was kind of new back then. So right now, we have this very interesting paradigm that's going on where we're combining digital with human-centered priorities. So we have AI over here and all the new technologies, and no one could figure out the impact. And we'll talk a little bit about AI and generations because I think it's fascinating, but a lot more questions and answers around AI. At the same time, we have this cultural driving force towards a wellness culture, a focus, particularly after COVID, on autonomy. People want autonomy. They want people to breathe and get away from work and work from home and have flexibility. And it was, productivity actually went up directly after COVID. Managers were shocked. They're like, oh my God, maybe we just let them do the work and they get it done, right? So this was like a huge shift in how, you had 50% of the people working from home. And so now, of course, they're starting to come back to work, but maybe a little bit not so much and maybe not so happy if they are, right? So you have this digital introduction to this new technology on AI, and you also have this kind of human-centered priority. I would say we are moving more towards human-centered priorities in the workplace now than we ever have been. And so what happens is that bosses need to pay attention to what their people are saying, what they're really saying, deep listening, surveys, conversations. How do we create a safe environment? That's something that a leader would never ask its employees, even 5 years ago, 10 years ago. How do we make this place safe? Safe you'd assume it was just like bodyguard safe. It's like, no, emotionally safe. So all these conversations are happening, and what's driving a lot of this human-centered focus is new generations, younger people. if you want to know how workplaces function in the future, look at the priorities of the young people because they're the ones that are going to be running things in 15, 20 years, 25 years, right? They're the ones that are going to be in charge. So they're in the power positions. And one of the things we know about generations is generational characteristics are they're unique and enduring. So they're different from other generations, but personality that you develop as an individual stays with you for the rest of your life. So generations carry through in a way. And so a way to think about generations is if you have 4 hotel rooms and every room is an age bracket, okay? The generations are groups of people that go through the hotel rooms. Start with room number 1 in their youth, and then they go to a young adult, and then midlife, and then old. Right? So the boomers are now is old.
Well, what describing, in some ways I'm kind of curious because I think that the boomers obviously did things very differently, but then you have all these other generations that have kind of come together. And I think we've got, 5 generations, in the workforce now. But, how do their expectations differ, in terms of, leadership and the workplace culture?
Well, they differ a lot, and I think it really matters. And it's important to understand how they differ and then what you could do about it. If we start with the boomers really value, let's see, this is the last generation that deeply understands the notions of hierarchy, that in a boomer's mind, there is an org chart and they're somewhere at the top, and everybody else is down here. And then there's people that are down there and down there. Generation X came along and it kind of started to flatten things, create more efficiency in the workplace. And now the younger generations are they're looking for the inverse pyramid. My voice is first. So I think with boomers, I think in terms of what their expectations of leadership, loyalty, hierarchy, they want respect. They've been around a very long time, and it's interesting. I mean, they watch their fathers get the gold watch for staying at IBM for 35 years. And so they kind of want the gold watch, where it doesn't matter what I've accomplished, but I've been here a really long time. So what do I get for that? Right. So that's very much the boomer. I think that's where they are now. And it's an interesting phase of life they're going through because they're old now. I mean, they're not even around the workplace that much. I think it's something like it's less than 20% of people in the workforce are boomers. It's getting really small. But their footprint is huge. So, I think, and you alluded to this earlier in your introduction, is that, we're living management and leadership style and all that. We're living in a boomer/Xer world, right? We're living in a world of older generations setting the ground rules. And this is why there's generational tension, because you have the younger generation saying, I don't like these ground rules. They're stupid. Can we get different ground rules? I want to. But anyway, so boomers. So loyalty, hierarchy, Xers completely different. They came along and said, you know what? The less you pay attention to me, the better. I want hands-off management. I want autonomy. I want independence. I want to be able to also go home at a decent hour and watch my kids, soccer game. That's the first generation that really introduced the notion of work-life balance. Actually, was Generation. I mean, Generation X they're hard. Generation X kind of works hard and parties hard. They're a hard generation, the tough guys. You think about, I don't know if you remember the Little Rascals. Remember the
Yeah.
They're like rolling up their sleeves and they're living on the street. And Xers came along at a time, and to understand any generation, you have to understand their place in history. And Generation X came of age at a time when very high crime rates in the cities. People complain about the crime rates not high. I mean, okay, let me just give you a data point. In New York City in 1991, there were 3,200 murders. Last year, there was 400.
Wow.
So anyway, so big differences. But Generation X grew up at a time when it really was dangerous when they were kids. 52% of all kids in high school in 1991 smoked cigarettes. Today, it's 9%. In my high school, we had a smoking lounge, student smoking lounge. It was separate from the faculty smoking lounge. It was great for. I wasn't a smoker, but that's where you find your weed. That's where there's a lot of drug use, a lot of that stuff as kids, and it was a generation of what's called latchkey kids, and younger generations won't remember this. But this is basically so the boomers figured out feminism, but they hadn't figured out parent about babysitting yet. And so the mom was working and the dad was working. So mom said to the kid who was in first grade, I won't be home when you get home at the end of the day. I'm going to give you a key. I'm going to put it around your neck. And then you could open up the lock and then you could get in. And then, by the way, once you're inside, do your homework and cook a meal for your sister and make sure everything's ready by the time we get home. So that was the experience of Generation X. Boomers were adored as kids, and Xers were ignored. It's the whatever generation. Whatever was a word that, I'm an Xer. I used to use that word as a teenager all the time. You just be like, okay. And your older brothers are out there trying to save the world as boomers, right? Going to Woodstock, and you're like, Woodstock was over by the time I got to be a teenager. There was never any fun. And then we had dealt with AIDS. And anyway, so that's a tangent on Generation X. But it's important to understand the lived experience of each of the generations because it allows you to understand their behavior now and their values and what they think is important. So independence, hands-off, autonomy, they want to be left alone. So millennials came along. I actually had, in my book, Second Wave Millennials, I actually personify each of the generations with a person. So, and the person's name is typically very reflective of the generation. So Dave is the boomer. Dave is a white man, right? And then X is, Generation X is Jennifer, because it's the most common name. I mean, like every third woman born in the 70s name is Jennifer. Wow. My wife's name is Jennifer. There's a lot of Jennifers out there born in the 70s. A white woman, Jennifer. And then Josh comes along, whose race is indeterminate. We're not really sure. Could be, I don't know. He's a mix of all kinds of things, But Josh is the millennial, and Josh had a very different coming of age experience than Dave or Jennifer. There was this huge social panic, and media picked up on it, politicians picked up on it, policymakers, everybody picked up on it and said, you know what, where our kids are feral. They are in trouble. They are committing crimes or doing drugs or doing all these things. We got to pay attention to our kids. So there's all these policies that came along as the millennials were being born. They were policies that protected the child. There were 16 child protection policies that happened in a 10-year period when the millennials were young. Amber alerts and all this. So there was a reconfiguration about the way we saw children, and the way we saw them was they're precious things. We have to take care of them. We have to pay attention to them, unlike the Xers. We didn't pay any attention to them. So their coming of age priorities actually were quite positive. They were purpose and community. The millennials, they grew up and they became like, Barney told me when I was watching TV that we should work together. And I go to school and all the teachers are saying work as a team, and mom and dad are saying that, and this is really important. And by the way, I'm best friends with mom and dad now. I don't rebel like the boomers did anymore. I love them. They're my best friend. So very, very different experience for millennials. They were overprotected, frankly, as children, but at the same time, they're very high achievers. Their parents expected a lot of them. And in fact, I believe this will be the best educated generation possibly in U.S. history. Education levels were going up, and then recently, the past 5 years, they've started to go down. I'm not sure Gen Z is going to have the same level of education as millennials actually had. Although the whole definition of education is changing, it's moving more towards skill-based anyway. So there's that. But millennials had a place that was very different, purpose-driven, collaborative, tech-savvy, always seeking meaning in their work. Then Gen Z comes along, and boy, you talk about a generation being influenced by history. I mean, generations are fundamentally influenced by what's called the PEST model: political, economic, social, and technology. All these things going on when you're being raised, you're coming of age, affect you as a person. Boy, I mean, Gen Z, you talk about what's going on in the world. They're just watching all this happen. And from our generation, we could look and say, okay, we could put this in perspective, kind of, although this is fairly unprecedented what's going on around the world right now. I mean, a little bit of, we kind of understand World War II and, the history and so forth, but this is all that Gen Z knows is the kind of chaos that goes on. Adam Tooze is a professor at Columbia University, and he said that we're going through what's called a polycrisis. in the world today. So political, geopolitical, economic, um, institutional, climate, like health, you name it. Like there's crises all around, and so this is a generation Gen Z that is growing up in the shadow of the crisis, and what their priority is safety. It is a crazy world, and I want to be safe, right? And I want to be taken care of. And so they get to work, and the expectation is the safety. And again, it's safety beyond physical protection. It's emotional safety to a large extent, right? So they also are looking at things and saying, the world's in a horrible mess, and I think we need to fix it. I mean, this is the generation that embraced Greta Thunberg. Is a classic example of a Gen Z. We gotta fix this thing. We don't have the power now. The oldest of us is 29 or whatever, but we really we want everybody to be happy and work together and all that collaborative stuff. There's a lot of similarities between Gen Z and millennials actually with respect to that.
Wait, let me ask you just about Gen Z and the workplace. That it seems like the Gen Z is the most interested in actually being in the office, despite growing up in a digital world.
Yeah, it's so interesting. The dynamic is so interesting because you would think, well, I mean, intuitively, I'd be like, oh, yeah, well, they all want to be home, working because they have their own computer and their own stuff and all that. The reality is, all the surveys suggest that they want to be in the office more than older generations. And there's a very distinct reason for that. They are not anti-remote. They're pro-connection. And they kind of get cultural work FOMO. They have a fear of missing out, of not figuring out what's going on at work. And you can't really figure out what's going on at work until you're there and you understand the culture. It's amazing how much you can understand a culture of an organization when all you got to do is walk into a building. I mean, you're an architect, right? Look around you. Look at all that will tell you a story about the culture, right, of an organization. So they want to understand what the story is of an organization, and they want to understand where the power levers are, and they're like babes, and they're like these little embryos. They just
Yeah.
yeah,
How about
you know.
social media, smartphones, the technology, Instagram? What's the impact that that's had on Gen Z's ability to succeed, in a traditional work environment?
All right, now we're in a serious topic because this is serious. I have in my bookshelf. The book is it's called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, and it's the first effort I think. Well, I would say I come from a survey research background. It's a very thorough book on the impact of social media on young people. It's really profound and it's really concerning. I live next door to the president of the PTA. My kids are older out and grown up, but I said you should read this. This is your kids. This is kind of your generation. So it's profound. It's concerning. It's the first generation to really go through adolescence online. They had a real kind of a phone-based childhood.
Can you describe some of the things that have changed, from the social media?
Yeah. So just kind of putting timelines around this. iPhone was invented in 2007, and then Instagram and all that stuff, and Facebook got real big by 2010. I always like to say the millennials were the masters of social media, and the Gen Z are the victims of social media because these organizations have figured out the algorithms to addict. The preference is addiction, right? And so by the time in 2015, someone was born in 2000 and they're 15 years old. When they were 10, that's when they started to kind of get into this stuff. What they find, the dividing line is if you were like, when all this stuff was out when you were like 10 and you started to use it, that's when some of the bad things happen. And I'll kind of outline some of the bad things. Substantial rates of anxiety, depression, social disconnection, different from boys and girls. Boys spend more time playing video games and less time on Instagram with their friends and all that. And that's actually helped them because they just translate that, the motherboard game ship to the military, whatever, you name it. Like you're just pressing buttons and like accomplishing stuff, getting bells, ringing things, it's all there's something about it that's a little bit useful for the future of work. The girls got wrapped up into what someone looks like, and they get a bad response from an Instagram, and they get depressed, and and get down about that. And so that's been a real negative thing. I think there's really kind of four areas that, from a workplace standpoint, social media has contributed to that companies really do need to address. The first is just social awkwardness. The number of companies that are dedicated to training Gen Z to do basic etiquette, eye contact, shaking hands. You go out to lunch, using your fork, literally using your fork. I mean, there are ways to embarrass yourself, if you're 22 years old and you haven't really been acclimated to a lot of things, right? And so I think there's and also, the way you've been communicating is through your device, not in person. There's much less in-person communication. People always look at the boomers and they're like, "Oh my God, they're so good at relationships and they're just really fluid." And you talk to boomers, they're great. I mean, they're amazing. I mean, the way that, well, just because they grew up, they didn't have to worry about that technology, get communicating through that, right? But with Gen Z, I think you have this kind of new culture that they're stepping in. Imagine there's these little embryos, they've gone through school and they did really well and they're really smart, they're really book smart, but to get into the real world, it's completely different. And they're showing up and they're like 22 and they don't know what's going on. And there's social awkwardness. I mean, the good news on that, very good news on the social awkwardness, is that it's treatable. And it doesn't take long and you can get them up to speed. And when they do want to come to workplace, interact with them in a way that's going to be helpful for them and positive, and just recognize that that's something that they're just going to be awkward.
How does their idea of career success differ?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a whole topic. It's very different. So if you imagine, I like work in metaphors all the time, but a metaphor of a ladder. You think about career ladders. What is a ladder? Well, you climb the ladder. And boomers and Xers, we look at each other and say, where are you on the rung of the ladder? Everybody can kind of visualize that. Everybody's looking to go linearly up and down. And I think that's a good metaphor for the older generations. For the younger generations, I would picture kind of a lattice, kind of a complex lattice or a climbing wall with, you could go left, you could go right, you could go forward, back. You could kind of go in all different directions. So getting to where you want to go might be just skill based. You may want to keep your close to your wellness culture and keep your side gig and do all the things you want to do that are important to you in your life, work on your music, whatever. But I'm not going to do the latter. I just want to develop my skills. Or I just want to be in a job that makes a difference to the world. I'm gonna leverage the empathy that I have, that I understand, that I have a language for, and I'm gonna actually apply that to making where I work a more purpose driven. And that's my goal. And if I don't have to make as much money to do that, I'm fine with it. I mean, this is a generation that, believe it or not, Xers are like, just show me the money. That's the way I was when I grew up. Show me the money. But the younger generations are like, show me the purpose. Show me the why. Why are we doing this?
For organizations, then, how does that change how we shape teams, how people are managed, how they're rewarded or incentivized?
Yeah, again, I think it's really profound changes. You have to start thinking about, I guess the first thing to think about is younger generations have a very high tolerance for self-disclosure. They're used to just pouring their guts out about everything. But how that translates is they expect transparency, like in pay. And I don't know if you've seen the articles, but there's a lot out there now about how younger generations are, they're sharing what they get paid. And they want to know what everybody else gets paid. It's not a big deal. Just tell me what you get paid. That level of transparency, I think, is expected. So I think that's something that could be done, that you'd have to acclimate older generations to, but is to start moving in the direction of being authentic and transparent, right? These are the things and the values that they have as younger generations. Well, there's no reason that older generations can't kind of do that as well. One of the recommendations I make is to actually sit down with your Gen Z and ask them what priorities they have in the workplace and what they want to accomplish and achieve. Typically, what we see is they're very driven by, they really want to learn and they want to develop their skills and they want training. Training budgets are being cut right now, which is the worst thing in the world for this generation. They have an expectation that they're going to and they will stay with the company if the company actually invests in them and actually puts them through basic training. I mean, from etiquette to manager training to leadership training all the way up. They really want that in a workplace. I think with Xers, it's like you're like, well, whatever. I'll get my own training. The street trained me. I'm fine with that. When I think about managing the different generations, I think about millennials and Gen Z are hands on, and then Xers and boomers are hands off. So you kind of want to drill down a little bit and pay attention.
I'm thinking about the technology and how rapidly that changes and the tools that we use. And how does a Gen Z person, do they adapt to that themselves, or do they need to be trained on how to update those things?
To do the technology?
Yeah. Yeah.
For Gen Z, if they, I will say, if they, so I have a younger generation person that helps me with my technology, and I will call this person when I have a problem, and they will solve that problem. They have never heard of the problem before. They didn't even know the thing existed. And by the way, they start with Googling, like, how do you fix this problem, which I have to learn how to do. So I think when it comes to technology, they're so quick and so fast and probably so far ahead of the next step than you ever will be. And actually, this is a huge strategic advantage. Have that kind of just prenatal understanding for technology for this generation, is that needs to be cultivated in mind and shared. I'm a huge believer in, and some companies are doing this, reverse mentoring programs where you have the boomers who can't wait to tell you a story about what happened when they were younger in their job and how they compare it to how you are younger and all that. And, boomers like to talk and share. And that's great. And Gen Z likes to listen. They're okay with that. And boomers need help on technology, and Xers, they need help navigating on this stuff. So it's a very simple thing. But the key is to be intentional about it. Companies, set up a program, call it something, do it, get your stars involved, get your best people involved in it, and then show a little bit of success, and then grow it. And before you know it, you have generations that are collaborating and talking to each other all the time. One of the reasons that generations don't get along is they use different languages. They use different ways of communicating, even. They're using different modes of communication. Text, I can't keep up with, am I supposed to put a smiley face on a text? Is that sarcasm now? I think, there's so many rules about that, but I think that moving towards in-person for all generations is a really positive salvo to a lot of the generational problems we're having. If we continue to be kind of remote, it's very hard to connect. It is very hard to connect and ultimately build trust in an organization.
How can leaders identify and leverage the strengths of the younger generation? Just what you're talking about in terms of finding what they're passionate about, where their skills are, what they like doing, that can be transferred and benefit the organization.
Yeah, I think about Gen Z. I think about, this, every generation has superpowers. Started using that because Gen Z and Millennial really liked it. But every generation has superpowers and comes to the table with things that are unique to them that could be kind of transferred to other generations. And for Gen Z, it really is about inclusivity, purpose, empathy, tech forward. Purpose is something that was really kind of introduced by millennials and kind of co-opted by Gen Z. And I think an example of how purpose plays out and how companies could take advantage of this, I've noticed this from many of my clients and the managers who tell me that I tell a young person what to do, and they always say, why do we need to do it that way? Or can you tell me more about that? Or how does that work? And can't they just do it? Like, I'm an Xer, I'm used to just tell me what to do and I'll do it. So this is a generation that asks why. Well, why is an important question, because if you're telling a Gen Z, hey, get this thing done because I got a sales meeting in the morning, I got to do a presentation to these folks that are new in sales. And the Gen Z looks at it and says, well, you might want to think about maybe using a new technology when you're presenting this, especially when there's young people there, and like what, so they actually want to go a little bit deeper, which is amazing. They actually think. They think, and leaders think. Leaders always ask, why are we doing these things, right? And so So I think what's important is older generations to acknowledge, not see the question of why are we doing this as a snarky thing, but like a genuine, legitimate interest in improving the outcome of whatever it is that you're producing. I think there's kind of a quality control, an internal quality control mechanism that Gen Z has, believe it or not, that older generations may just gloss over. Well, it's been done this way before. Why would we change? That's very much an attitude of an older generation. The younger generation is like, well, nothing is working now. So maybe we can improve it. But the way they communicate that and then the way it's heard from older generations is kind of, and that's where you need to really start with communications.
For multi-generational teams, what are some suggestions or best practices on how they could collaborate effectively? Because I think the workplace is becoming much more social. It's much more focused on collaboration now, and we've got more generations that are showing up.
Yeah, I would, and that's true. And a lot of organizations can't really define it, and they don't really know what's going on. And there's just a generational difference. There's a fundamental generational difference in that. And so I would put that as a priority number one is in communicating. The best practices for building mixed generations to collaborate. You want to kind of start with why the company and the organization is doing what they're doing and define the purpose very clearly and have them align on how they approach solving. Every company has a problem they're trying to solve. What is the problem we're trying to solve in this company? How fast can we make these widgets so that our supplier could get the stuff. But it's not just about efficiency. It's about focusing on why are we doing this? So our clients could actually do things quicker and more efficiently, or so our clients could have better outcomes and with their suppliers or whatever. That's a discussion that I call it to having why circles. Get together in a circle and ask the question why. And the Japanese had a great, I don't know if they still do it, but when I did some work for Toyota and they had the 5 whys. They always ask why, and then why, and then why is that happening? It's a little like a 3-year-old. It's a little bit of annoying, but it really, what it does is it brings together all the generations to realize a shared purpose. Everybody wants a shared purpose. The younger generations just need to know what it is, and the older generations need to share it and recognize that the younger generations are interested in that. So I think why circles are good. I think clarifying expectations and communications is before you even get to why circles is really key. So when should I write an email versus a text? When should I, how do you want the email sent to the client? I think younger generations have a different view of how information is passed along. And so a lot of times younger generations don't use periods or misspell things. And I don't know if you've noticed, but sometimes I get texts, from my kids, and it's just like, oh, that's, you got to see, we're just used to full sentences.
Well, nobody wants to pick up the phone anymore. So.
They don't pick up the phone. So when do you pick up the phone and when you don't pick up the phone? So all of these things, clearly lay them out so everybody knows what the expectations are and everybody knows how to kind of approach that. I think building knowledge exchange is a great way for generations to collide. So coming together at a learn at lunch and feature a person that's going to talk about themselves a little bit and what they do in the organization and how they do it and how it matches to the shared purpose that the audience is out there doing it. I think too often we get in our own little comfort zone circles. And a lot of time we get into our comfort zone on the generations that we are, and we don't spend enough time listening to the younger generations about where they're coming from. I'm always amazed when I get into a conversation with a Gen Z. They're like so smart and thorough and like, oh, I didn't know they talked this much. I'm like, they actually talk a lot and they have a lot to say. And it's really interesting. So I think if companies have the ability to make that intentional, you do need to make it intentional. You need to schedule the learn at lunches. You need to have leaders go to them and use it as a model for people to follow. That makes a big difference. Important. Younger generations like to know that it's safe to share things. They can actually say things without reprimand, without being punished, right? They don't want to be punished. There's a lot of punishment going on in leadership and management these days, but they don't like that. And it's going to be hard for them to actually come out of their shell if they don't feel like they're in a safe place. where, what they say won't be criticized.
Well, you had mentioned earlier about some of the language differences and the way that the different generations speak. And so I'm just wondering if there's a way to mitigate that among, in those conversations.
Yeah, I think step one is to like if each of the generations understands how technology is used and how each generation communicates, they have an orientation. Everybody needs an orientation with how everybody else communicates. So we know. And then we need to go in and say, okay, this is a company. This is the way we're going to do it here. Right. So just kind of laying it out. These are the expectations. And if you have trouble, if the expectation is that when you send an email to a client and you have punctuation that works and all that, and you make sure to sign it, and that's the expectation. Young people need to learn that. That would be important for them to learn. And I don't think that's a sacrifice. The gods of the boomers. We're sacrificing on behalf of the boomers. I think there's business expectations. You got to meet the client where they are. So wherever the client is that's the way you need to communicate with them and internally with the organization, right? And then you are an authentic organization. If you're actually doing the work inside the organization that you're doing with your clients, that's something young generations really like, is that authenticity and that thoroughness, I think.
I think you talked about some of the ways that organizations can prepare, for the different generations that are coming into the workforce. Are there any overarching suggestions when you have 4 or 5 different generations, in the same work environment?
Yeah, I think. I think number one is, and by the way, typically, so right now we're probably more close to 4, not 5. There's not many people in the silent generation, which is older than the boomers, that are working right now. And the next generation after Gen Z is Alpha generation, and they're like 12, so they shouldn't be in your workplace. So we are looking at the core 4 generations. I think it's weird. I mean, I think a little bit of a history lesson about what makes a generation, and literally going through. I mean, I go into organizations and I do a level set, and I talk to entire organizations, sometimes at big conferences that they have, and I actually go through each of the generations and tell a story about how they came of age and what they're all about and what that means in terms of how you're going to be interacting with them and what their superpowers are. And by the way, how do you collaborate with them once you're in the workplace? Having that ground level, that ground set knowledge is really important. And I'm a big believer in, just teach folks how to fish, don't sell them fish. So let me provide you with the outline. Anybody could do this out there. Obviously there's a lot of people that do the generational work, but just informing them on that. We do whole workshops on intergenerational collaboration. I mean, the amazing thing is you get these generations together, they are like best friends after one day. And all of a sudden they're communicating and learning about each other, right? Just because you actually were intentional and spent the time to do that kind of made the difference, I think.
So there's a lot of talk now about AI and automation reducing traditional entry-level roles. How is that going to affect Gen Zs and maybe even Gen Alphas as they start to emerge in the workplace?
Well, I'm glad okay, so that's the topic. That's a massive topic we could spend another hour on. I will say there's one data point that just came out last week. Stanford University it's the first thorough piece of research that gives us a clue in terms of how bots and AI are going to affect and impact the employment numbers, first of all, in the workplace. And it turns out that there's a 13% drop in positions that would have gone to humans that are not going to bots. And that's just 22 to 25-year-olds. And that's just within the last year. Okay. And we're like a year into AI, or a year and a half, and since anyone knew what ChatGPT was, right? So I think the first thing to realize is that we might be moving in a very interesting direction. We're not sure if there's going to be large scale unemployment with young people if that continues, because those are the roles that are most impacted. And so what do we do with all these young people if the bots are actually kind of taking their jobs? So yeah, the standard starting positions, data, entry, admin, coding, junior analyst are all being replaced with AI. There's a disproportionate impact in the workplace, affecting men more than women, because women tend to get into teaching and healthcare and as industries, and men on the technology side. So, okay, so how do we think about that? I think the way to think about that is jobs in the future are more likely to be modular and skill based. And also we skip the resume. College may not matter. The 4 year may not matter. It may be you drilling into a specific skill that you do well. So I think the macro picture is really uncertain. Anybody that comes on a show and tells you that they know what's going to happen with AI is not. I mean, they don't. There's too much uncertainty in it. Okay, the current AI that exists, for example, that I use ChatGPT all the time. I use it every day. That's just information I get. Refine this proposal for me and so forth, and it does a really good job. At a higher level, you have coding and so forth. There's going to be a lot of interface that kind of the next level up above the AI. It's kind of like the 27, 28, 29, 30-year-olds. I think they're going to be fine. And they're going to be ones that are going to interact the most with AI and teach you what AI is doing. So that it's weird, but literally if you're there's a big difference between if you're 27 to 32, like my kids, or if you're in your early 20s. I don't know what to tell you about the early 20s. I don't know if they're going to be working for you. But there's still going to be Gen Zs that are going to be teaching you about AI and are going to be introducing you things that you've never heard before. And that's where the innovation is going to come from. So one of the things I always recommend is, a Chief Z officer group, right? CZO, right? Get a bunch of Gen Z together. If you're the CEO, get them and just sit in on their meetings and throw out a problem and see how they solve it. They will figure out technology for you faster than anything you've ever figured out. 45-year-old CEOs are like, their minds are blown because their life will change and their business model change because they sat down for an hour with a couple Gen Z who had incredible solutions, right? So that's powerful, and that's intergenerational collaboration right there.
Fascinating. Our audience is predominantly facility managers, architects, designers, and I'm curious if you have any suggestions, changes to the work environment, things that we can do to improve what the work environment looks like, how it performs, how it accommodates younger generations.
Yeah, I thought about this question. I knew you were going to ask this, but I think it's the way to think about it is think about some of the words I use to describe and the values that were associated with some of the younger generations, because the values need to be reflected in how you operate, how you're built, what you look like, how you essentially function in your physical environment, right? But when you start with the values, flexibility, we know the extras brought into the workplace. So the modular nature, the physical modular nature of the workplace is going to be critical. Collaboration. This is a word that shows up for Gen Z and millennials in particular. Those spaces that encourage and allow for collaboration. Also, we didn't really talk about the wellness culture, but Gen Z has introduced the wellness culture, and so a sense of well-being. And that might mean the whole corner office thing. I remember at Gallup when we were expanding space and I had a corner office, but I was going to get another one that was even bigger upstairs. And then the CEO decided, you know what? You're not going to get that office. That's going to be a conference room. And I was really pissed off. But it's like, yes, that should not go to fewer people. That should go to more people. So some sense of kind of equitability and reverse pyramiding there in terms of your design. I think a biophilic design, maybe. I mean, this whole wellness culture. I mean, how do you actually let natural light in and allow for that? How do we improve our wellness culture and figure out how we could exercise more? Are there accesses to fresh and healthy foods and exercise? I do work for Bloomberg, and I don't know if you've been in their office. I don't know if you've been in their London offices, but oh wow, that's a Fosters and Partners collaboration. It's extraordinary. It is amazing, and it reflects what all the values that they believe in. That it's this window that overlooks on St. Paul. Basically, what it says to me is we're going to be here for a while. This Bloomberg building is going to be here for a while. We've been looking at that for a long time. So you have this kind of solidness and this ready for the future kind of thing, but part of the past and and all that stuff. Community gardens, I mean, it sounds really stupid, but whatever's going to actually make people be more healthy is going to be a design that's going to be, I think, in demand. The things that Neil Howe and I did early on when we did some work for Marriott, and we talked about the configuration of their hotels. And what we said was, well, and this was years ago, we said, well, the millennials are going to come along and they're going to want bigger collaborative spaces and smaller rooms, individual rooms. And that's what they did. I don't know if it was because of us. They probably did it anyways, but the rooms got smaller, and then all the collab spaces kind of increased to get access to what people wanted and need them to make them better. Environmental sustainability, obviously, it's just, well, I don't know if that's the direction things are going, but it certainly was. But that is important to younger generations, and I think everybody to a large extent. So, having those values come out in the physical manifestation, I think, is really, it's more important now than ever before. I think design.
How about the whole
absolutely.
concept of diversity and equity in the work environment? I would imagine that's still a pretty high priority for them.
Oh, I mean, it's everything. So the extent that you could design something that reflects that is, and I don't think that's going to go away. That'll be here for a while. I mean, keep in mind that they will be the leaders, Gen Z, in, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35 years, long time horizons. When you're constructing physical assets, you're looking long time horizons, right? So you need to be thinking about that generation and what they value and what's important to them.
Great. Well, Warren, I want to be respectful of your time. This has been a great conversation. Is there anything, I mean, I know there's a lot of things we've left out, but anything that you feel would be important to include as part of this?
I guess, I think the fundamental idea that generations is a thing that is, it's a diversity, it's a form of diversity, just like race and age and gender, right? And I think people don't really think of it that way. But I mean, we do a lot. We do a lot of DEI work in generations, and I think opening up and shining a light on generations from that perspective is really important, because it gets companies into really thinking about their future, what's important to them, how they could improve communications, how they could improve efficiencies in the organization, how they can improve outcomes. I think that generational collaboration is very, very closely tied to that in many ways. And the great thing about generations is once you understand the story of each of the generations, you could pretty much extrapolate from there and have an understanding, how they're going to act and what motivates them and what's important to them. So yeah, I mean, we are in the fourth paradigm, back to the first thing I was talking about, right? This kind of human-centered and digital coming out right now. So think about all of this in that context, I suppose, right? Just wrapping it around to what we originally talked about.
Well, Warren, thank you very much. This has been a great conversation, and I've learned a few things that I'll be able to apply to daily life. Thank you very much.
It's been a real pleasure, Bob. Thanks for inviting me.